Okay, welcome back. Today is the day after Christmas Day, and so I got to spend some time with family, even though personally I like to spend less time with family. But I over time come to understand how important family is and about how, whether you like it or not, that's who your people are. And moving out from just the nuclear family to the extended family and on to the higher levels of aggregation. You can't get rid of who your family are, and you can't choose who they are. So I think it's good to get out of your personal space, your individualist mindset, and try to build up relationships with your family members, which is more or less the way that everybody lived and had to organize themselves before the modern era. Everything started with the nuclear family and it moved up through the extended family and the kin group, tribe, clan, nation, etc. So that's a good thing, even if it is difficult to deal with other people's personalities, and you give other family members who are caught up in individualism a good role model, or just a model to try to do that for themselves. And I've seen this work in practice, so I know that it does work. And I once had somebody tell me, someone who I did not think was a very wise person, someone whose opinion I did not value, told me something that I think is true. They said that if you have a large family and you're on good terms with them, you're not going to have a whole lot of friends. And people who have a whole lot of friends, good friends, typically don't have large families or good relationships with their family. So people have a need for a network of people that they can rely on and communicate with and confide in. This is just a basic human need, and it's either going to be filled by friends or family. So if you have a family, I hope that you were able to visit with them on Christmas and the rest of these holidays. And if not, I hope that you do have a network of friends that you could do that with. Because one way or another, we have got to fulfill these basic human personal needs. Otherwise, we kind of fall backwards out of personhood and turn into something else. So that's my holiday message. We'll talk now. We're going to do a two-part thing, and first we're going to talk about this last video and some good comments that people made. Bring us up to date on those contributions that came from the viewers and commentators, and then we'll move on into a different topic after that. So Mr. Coolmug suggested, for our missing space here between social democracy and conservatism, he suggested populism. And I don't know how to fit it in, but I think he's right. I don't know if some of these ideologies need to be rearranged or if they need to take on different names or be described differently, but I see where he's coming from, and I think he's correct. So if anybody has further suggestions about that, I'd be happy to hear them. But I haven't thought about it enough to offer a convincing argument for it or against it, but I think that's the solution to this issue. He also suggested that social democrats, or at least some of them, can be involved in the fight against the New World Order, and that I cannot see. I can't see it, because it seems to me like everywhere social democrats go, they are working to build up the globalist state or the Zog state, and that they are the preferred partner. Social democracy reigns in the European world, in the continental world, I should say, and neoliberalism reigns in the Anglo-Atlanticist world. And so those are the two public faces of the ruling class. Maybe they're not the ruling ideologies. Maybe the ruling ideologies are something else, but those are the public faces. And to the extent that other activists or politicians who present as social democrats look like they might be on our side or just against the same people that we're against, I have to say I think they must be presenting as social democrats and actually be offering a different ideology. I think that would be my take. Another comment that came up, and a conversation I had with one of my email correspondents, frequent correspondent, was about religion and authoritarianism. And so the question was, would monarchism be considered under authoritarianism? And I would say yes. Modern authoritarianism is strongman, military dictatorship, junta, all that stuff. But traditional authoritarianism is European monarchy. That's what it is, and it is more decentralized than fascism or National Socialism or any of the other ideologies to the top of it. But it still concentrates a large amount of power in the central body, which is the monarch. And both authoritarian military dictators and monarchs are locked in a perpetual, never-ending battle with the nobles in their society. And if the nobles win, then we move into oligarchy, generally. Or, alternatively, if the burghers and the mercantile class can rise up, then they just kill the king and institute a republic, and it's also oligarchy. So anyhow, that's just that's my take on the authoritarianism. The religious question comes in by saying, well, if we have, let's say, a Buddhist society or a Catholic society, how does that affect this stuff? How does that affect our place on these ideologies? And I think that this chart of ideologies is only for modern Western European style civilization, states, governments, cultures. To the extent that we colonize other places in the world and destroy their traditional cultures and bring in sort of a bastardized or mutated form of our culture and civilization to them and force that on them, or if they adopt it on their own, then they kind of move into this. But I think some kind of traditional Buddhist society like Thailand or something, or China or Japan, they just have such a different way of looking at the world that we could kind of fit them into one of these slots. We could just call them authoritarian or something, but to me it just seems like they're fundamentally different. But in the modern world, they get drug in here. But our native religious traditions, I think, like I just said, monarchy falls under authoritarianism, and Protestant Christianity is sort of half in that and half in market liberalism. Everybody knows about the association between Protestantism and modern economics and free trade. I don't think we need to get into that. But I guess just to sum it up quickly, I would say that whatever the religious flavor of the society is, that is going to enable or disable certain of these political ideologies. Now, that has pretty strong implications when we're talking about Trotskyism, communism, neoliberalism, or social democracy, because those four in the upper left quadrant are, I guess I would say, godless and perhaps even Talmudic, we could say, ideologies. And so if it were the case that religion enabled or disabled certain of these ideologies, what would be the conclusion? How would we establish social democracy? We would have to say we were in a godless society. And how would we establish Trotskyism? We would have to be in a Talmudic society. So those are my additional comments on that. And there were a bunch of other good comments, but I don't think we have time to go through them. Those were just the ones that were at the top of my mind. So I thank everybody who contributed to that. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about, I'm going to stop the video and put some more slides together, and then we're going to talk about conspiracy theories and left-hand pathism, a couple other things. Okay, I'll be right back. This is going to be a difficult one to try to bring all this together into one coherent message, but we're gonna do our best anyway. So one thing that I do and I know a lot of other people do it too, and maybe you do it as well, but I go to videos on YouTube or other places on the internet that I think might have a lot of people watching them that would be susceptible to our arguments, our viewpoints, and our evidence. And I, quote unquote, drop some truth bombs there for them. Or I practice the Socratic method and just ask some inconvenient questions. And I don't, you never know how effective this is, but it's one thing that you can do quickly and simply to try to help some other people and to help us too. And so, doing this, I got a comment from this guy named Whiskey Hammer 90, who disagrees with me and says that. So first we'll talk about the issue. Western governments, I believe, destabilize the societies that they control in order to both prop themselves up and to create an appetite for the kind of social changes and social engineering that they want to implement. So this is a pretty basic argument, basic theory. A lot of people have written about this and a lot of people have talked about it. So for instance, if you want to change the fundamental structure of the white European family because you read or wrote The Authoritarian Personality and you believe that healthy, intact, white European families are the source of authoritarianism and are therefore a threat to you and your group, then you need to destroy the white European traditional family structure. Now, you can't just go in full bore with the sexualization of children and the transsexualization of children. You have to start way back somewhere else, start destroying the thing, and then work your way forward to the truly toxic and destructive elements. And let's take E. Michael Jones's argument and say that the first wave was suburbanization. And so in order to break up European ethnic neighborhoods in the United States, you start moving large numbers of black people from the American South, which was their traditional homeland in the New World. You move them north into the Northeast, into the upper Midwest, Chicago, and everywhere else. And so you subsidize large amounts of housing for them in the urban centers, and talking about how exactly, talking about the race issue, we'll just stay out of that completely, and we'll just say that problems emerge. And so the result is the destruction of these European, more or less homogenous European ethnic communities, like we'll say Germans, Polish, Irish, Lithuanians, whatever they happen to be. They all get kicked out to the suburbs and they become deracinated. So they then become a more or less homogenous group of people, and now that their ethnic character has been taken away, they are further weakened for this attack. And then the next attack is feminism, and then the next attack is over-sexualization of young people, and then the full-blown attack on children, right? Okay, so this has all been plotted out and explained, and it benefits the elites who do have a control, who have the majority of social power in terms of media, banking, and everything else. So this is what I believe. Hold on just a second. Okay, my child was starting to wake up and that wrecked my train of thought, but I took care of that and hopefully I can finish what I need to do before I forget about it. I just finished making a justification for how I think it's very well demonstrated that the disruption of public life may be more valuable to the ruling elite in the Western world than simply higher production. They may prefer certain types of production, or they may prefer to make certain sacrifices in production or utility or something else in order to change the rules of the game or the structure of the society. And the best example I can think of this is what happened in the Soviet Union with collectivization and the development of heavy industry and the creation of the large urban populations. They sacrificed all of their birth rate essentially, and gave up a population of, I don't know, 30 or 50 million people in terms of raw birth rate by moving all of this formerly rural peasant type population into the cities, putting them in factories, providing them with access to contraceptives and abortion and divorce and all this other stuff. So in that case, the rulers of society had certain things that they wanted to accomplish. They wanted the development of heavy industry, and in order to do that, they made these gigantic sacrifices in other areas and fundamentally changed the way that the society was structured. If you don't think that the rulers of the West are doing the exact same thing along different lines, you're naive. Okay? The social engineering is occurring and has been occurring here too. It's just different. They have different goals. Okay, so again, he said, I don't get this idea that the elites somehow want to intentionally cause this massive, disruptive, mass terrorist attacks in the imperial territory, since it disrupts commerce and public life. And so we're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about the Great Depression, for instance, which I think most people now agree was a manufactured crisis. And the goal was for the top speculators to grab as much of the market as possible. And this kind of behavior goes way back, goes back to the Battle of Waterloo, in which the British branch of the Rothschild family basically cleans out all the other top-level speculators and concentrates the gains from this market activity in a small group of hands. And so the Great Depression in America did exactly the same thing. And you say, well, this was really, really destructive to the society. Why would the rulers of the United States want to destroy so much wealth? And, essentially, I think it's like 15 years of wealth is destroyed in that event. Well, it concentrated, how much money in the hands of them, essentially, as opposed to being distributed throughout the rest of the society. So, if you have to kill some of your slaves in order to cow the rest of them into submission, then that's, that may be something that you're willing to do. I'll be right back. Okay, a couple more words about the last Great Depression before we move on to the next topic. The people who gained out of the Great Depression were the money power, the top of the money power, and also the bureaucrats in the United States federal government. Everybody else lost. Everybody across the rest of the world lost. Those were the people who gained, and those were also the people who helped to implement this thing, most likely. And so, just as a direct consequence of the Great Depression, you had FDR be elected, and you had his administration, which massively expanded the involvement of the United States government into every sector of the American economy and brought in a whole bunch of guys, originally through the Department of Agriculture and the Department of the Treasury, who were communists, who were communist sympathizers, and who wanted to institute a one-world government. And so all of this stuff is a direct consequence of the Great Depression, which I think most people would agree is a direct consequence of the Federal Reserve Act and these machinations that were set in place much before. So they got what they wanted, and they had to disrupt the commerce and public life of the imperial territory to do it directly. So that's my thesis on that. The second topic that I wanted to talk about is Operation Northwoods. And Operation Northwoods is a declassified briefing from the top levels of the American military that suggested performing a false flag terrorism attack on a U.S. population. So this was going to be a plane flight full of students, basically, They were going to either claim that the Cubans, in this case, this is during the Cold War and the Kennedy administration, the military was going to either blow up a real plane full of students or a fake plane full of fake students or a real plane full of fake students, and then blame this terrorist attack on Cuba. And this was going to be a casus belli for a full-blown invasion, not like the Bay of Pigs, not an espionage commando operation, but a full-blown naval invasion, ground troops, air support, ships, everything. Full invasion of the Cuban island of Hispaniola. And so this is all declassified. It's all fully admitted. It did not take place, but this proves that the top people, the top administrators in the American government were willing to do either a false flag or a real attack on American civilians in order to pursue a geopolitical goal. So that's my second piece of evidence. This is no longer in any kind of gray area or debate or anything. This is really important, and this is one of the most important things to tell people about, in my opinion, is Operation Northwoods. Now, the third thing that I want to talk about, probably the thing that I know the least about, but is just as important perhaps as Operation Northwoods, is Operation GLADIO. This is what it's called. I don't think that it has an official name for the entire project, but we know it by the Italian name. So what happened, to my understanding, is that in 1945, after the end of World War II, there was a faction of the American government that wanted to pursue basically American domination of the world. There was another faction that wanted to pursue an Atlanticist condominium with Great Britain over the world. Pardon me. And then there was a third faction that wanted to pursue an American-Soviet condominium over the world, and the eventual unification of American power and Soviet power through a body like the United Nations that would institute the one world government. And if you think that this third faction is unrealistic or impossible, I can show you the documents where these people were talking about it in 1946 and 47 during the presidential race. So Henry Wallace, FDR's former vice president, was one of these Marxists who came in through the Department of Agriculture, and he was directly advocating for one world government and peace with the Soviet Union and cooperation with the Soviet Union. So, as we know from history, factions 2 and 3 lost out, or I don't know which one I said, but the Atlanticist faction lost out, the pro-Soviet faction lost out, and the one that won was the strict American dominance. I'll be right back. So we talked about these different political ideologies, and America was functioning like an oligarchy, and it had these multiple factions in it. But by contrast, the Soviet Union with Joseph Stalin, it was a state essentially ruled by one man. And so he either had more power in his regime, or he was smarter than the jury system of all these different people who were operating in the American government, who were often working at cross purposes and undercutting each other and killing each other. But Stalin saw the writing on the wall, and I think he knew that the pro-Soviet faction would lose and that some kind of Cold War would eventually get started. So in, I think, 46, he was already starting to clamp down on all the territories that had come under Soviet dominion, and something like a Cold War was already starting to develop. And the Americans, and particularly the American world domination faction, reacted to this by recruiting the people. This is Operation GLADIO we're talking about the beginning of. The American world domination faction now started to recruit the very people that it was said America had to get involved in the World War to prevent from having any influence on public life or Western civilization. So we're talking about the right-wingers, the authoritarians, the fascists, the National Socialists. So these people who were declared total anathema were brought into the Western fold. A lot of them. Some of them, of course, were hung. They were, the ideological leaders more or less were killed, but the technical men and a lot of the warriors themselves were brought in. And they were done, this was done in order to build up some kind of barrier against the Soviet Union in case there were, as there had been 20 and 30 years ago, communist revolutions in Western Europe. The Communist Party was very strong in Italy, it was very strong in France, and a lot of the other areas in Eastern Europe were under total communist domination, and therefore they could feed in people to Western Europe to foment rebellions and things. So from the perspective of these Western governments in the United States in particular, they didn't know if they might lose some territory. So they wanted to build up partisan-style guerrilla groups who would hide amongst the civilian population and attack any type of communist government that might spring up or a Soviet invasion. Now, I'm pretty sure that that's contrary to all the laws of war, but what do you expect from Western democracy? They lie, they lie, they lie, that's all they do. So they developed these underground partisan and guerrilla groups, and 40 years later, this stuff became public knowledge. And so we've got a document here. I have a document pulled up. This is the United States State Department in 2006 refuting or attempting to refute a book that was published on the topic. So this is going to take a little while to read, but we're gonna go through it. So I guess I don't know if I should explain more or if I should just read this. Well, just to recapitulate, the original explanation for things like or Operation GLADIO was to fight a potential Soviet or communist insurrection or Soviet invasion. That's what it was originally for, okay? And it employed former fascists, former authoritarians, former National Socialists, proving that the Western ruling elite are totally bankrupt when it comes to a consistent ideology. Misinformation about, quote, GLADIO / stay behind, end quote, networks resurfaces. 30-year-old Soviet forgery cited by researchers. This is from the U.S. State Department. In December 2005, misinformation resurfaced in Greece, claiming, falsely, that a secret quote-unquote stay-behind network, which the Greek government had set up with CIA assistance, had committed acts of terrorism. During the Cold War, West European countries set up clandestine quote-unquote stay-behind networks, which were designed to form the nucleus of resistance movements if the Soviet Union invaded and occupied Western Europe. Okay, so let's be pretty clear about this. So do you believe, let me ask you, do you believe that countries like France, West Germany, Denmark, Italy, do you think that they all simultaneously developed the same stuff while they were also being protected by the American military from potential Soviet invasion? Do you think that this coordinated effort to develop these same tactics all happened independently? The Greek writer making the claim, and a Swiss researcher who wrote a 2005 book on the quote-unquote stay-behind networks, both give credence to a Soviet forgery from the 1970s, which has long been publicly identified as a phony document. GLADIO, which means sword in Italian, was the name the Italian government chose for the quote-unquote stay-behind network it established in the early days of the Cold War. So what the State Department's trying to do here is to push all this stuff off on the individual Western governments that were part of the, if not NATO in the case of France, which was in and out, under the umbrella of the NATO protection. During World War II, anti-Nazi resistance movements had sprung up throughout Europe, but supplying them by airdrops and other risky measures had been difficult and uncertain. The quote-unquote stay-behind networks sought to avoid such problems by stockpiling weapons in secret caches ahead of time and recruiting volunteers who would form the core of resistance movements if needed. So instead of calling these things what they were, which were, guys who are performing terrorist acts who aren't in uniform and who would be, this is illegal stuff under anything like the Geneva Conventions or any type of international law. They're resistance movements. So they're always terrorists when they're on the other side, and they're freedom fighters or resistance movements when they're on the side of the Western democracies. But that's not anything new. This is just the typical language that we always see. The program remained one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets until it was revealed in late in 1990, first in Italy and then in other Western European countries. So there was an enormous scandal is what happened, and some of these guys in the Italian government, Tim Kelly has done a lot on this, and I think he actually interviewed this guy, the Swiss guy who wrote the 2005 book, and some other stuff as well. And I'm pretty sure that the mafia, the Italian mafia and the American mafia, and the Vatican and those crazy Masonic networks, the P2 Lodge and all of that is tied into this Project GLADIO stuff. But you're not going to hear about that here. But it's just absolutely filthy. It's absolutely filthy how much internationalist secret society scum was going on with this. But we'll continue. Soon after the stay-behind networks were revealed, some media accounts accused them of misdeeds, including domestic acts of terrorism. In April 1992, some 18 months after GLADIO's disclosure, journalist Jonathan Whitney wrote in The Nation that, quote, evidence so far hasn't supported initial allegations that the secret armies used their hidden CIA-supplied caches of weapons and explosives to carry out political violence that killed civilians, end quote. Nevertheless, such claims resurfaced on December the 18th, 2005 in To Proto Tema, Greece's best-selling investigative or sensationalist Sunday newspaper, which ran a full two-page story by Kleanthis Grivas, headlined, quote, Terrorism in Post-War Europe, end quote. Grivas accused Greece's quote-unquote stay-behind network of several assassinations and bombings. Some of these claims are clearly absurd. Grivas accused Greece's quote-unquote stay-behind network, known as Sheepskin or Red Sheepskin, which he says was organized by Greek special forces and the CIA, of assassinating CIA Station Chief Richard Welch in Athens in 1975. Thus, Grivas bizarrely accuses the CIA of playing a role in the assassination of one of its own senior officials. Grivas also accused Sheepskin of the assassination in Athens of British military attaché Stephen Saunders in 2000, despite the fact that the Greek government stated that it dismantled the stay-behind network in 1988. In reality, the Greek terrorist organization 17 November was responsible for both assassinations. So there are several claims here. One claim is that it's ridiculous, or that the political violence that killed civilians is not to be linked to this stuff. Now, you may know that those enormous student protest movements in Germany that were carried out in the late 1960s, one of the most inflammatory events that occurred was a West German policeman shot one of the students essentially in the back of the head during the march or during the protest and killed him. And I can't remember those guys' names, but you could look it up. Now, the West German police officer turned out to be a double agent who was working for the Stasi, the East German secret police. And so the whole point of a West German police officer who was secretly a Stasi member killing one of these students is to ignite the spark to cause the student movement to essentially carry out a Bolshevik revolution in West Germany. This was the intention behind these kinds of acts. So to suggest that governments, whether they're the lying scumbag Western so-called democratic governments or the Eastern Bloc governments, to suggest that they wouldn't kill civilians or carry out political violence against civilians for political goals and to create social unrest, that's ridiculous. That doesn't even stand there on its face. And of course, all these things were denied at the time, and later on they were all revealed, and our faces are being rubbed in it eventually, right? This is the revelation of the method thing that Michael Hoffman talks about. The next claim was that these people were, the Stay Behind network was responsible for several assassinations and bombings, and that one of the absurd claims is that a CIA station chief, Richard Welch, could not have been killed by a CIA-affiliated group in 1975. But to suggest that groups don't kill their own people who don't fit in or don't have, or that they have problems with, to suggest that that can't occur is ridiculous. I think most people at this point are on board with the notion that General Patton was assassinated in the occupation period after the end of World War II because he had such strong disagreements with Eisenhower and all of his cronies about how the occupation should have been conducted, and about the point of holding up Patton's Third Army, I think it was, for 6 weeks on the Elbe while the Soviets captured Berlin. So those kind of things don't make any sense unless you consider how Patton's total disagreement with that immediately resulted in his death from a pretty minor car crash. So the idea that governments and military organizations and everybody else in the world won't kill their own people who dissent is it's ridiculous on the face of it. I don't know anything about Richard Welch or why he was killed, but the fact that that they say it's impossible that such a thing could occur is ridiculous. Like we have these phrases like palace coup and palace politics for a reason, because people in the upper levels of the power structure are always fighting against each other. Now, the last claim that I wanted to talk about in that section is the idea that they're going to push off these assassinations on another terrorist organization called 17th of November. Now their Stay Behind networks are freedom fighters and resistance movements, and the other people are terrorist organizations. Okay. Well, one thing that I haven't seen other people talk about is that if this really is a strategy of conflict, a strategy to create social conflict by taking former fascists, National Socialists, and authoritarians and getting them to kill people, then you wouldn't just want to have a fascist group, you would also want to have communist groups. And all of these countries had militant communist terror squads essentially operating in them. France did, Germany did, Italy did, Greece did. And so I would say it's probably an open question whether those red terror squads and red assassination squads that were operating in those countries, whether they were operated by the Soviet Union or whether they were actually operated by NATO and the Western governments. And you just keep your two groups running in parallel at the same time. You have each of them carry out retaliatory assassinations, and all of that creates more social conflict and gives you more of a reason to tighten down on people and throw them in jail. And when you have both of those groups operating at the same time, you can also put any left-wingers or right-wingers in jail if those people are not part of the controlled opposition, because you can just frame them and accuse them of being parts of those groups that you actually control. And then so all of your informants and your people walk free, and anyone who provides a real opposition, whether it's coming from the left or the right, you can just pin everything on them. We'll do the final section here. 30-year-old Soviet forgery cited by researchers. Grivas and other prominent quote-unquote stay-behind researchers appear to have been influenced by a bogus text that first surfaced in 1976, a Soviet forgery purporting to be Supplement B to the U.S. Army's Field Manual 3031. The U.S. Army did have a field manual, FM 3031, in the 1970s, and a Supplement A to it existed, but not a Supplement B. The purported Supplement B was a forgery apparently concocted by the Soviet Disinformation Service. Field Manual 3031B, also known as the Westmoreland Manual because it was purportedly signed by General William Westmoreland, was exposed as a quote-unquote total fabrication in February 1980 hearings before the U.S. House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And I would say, hey, well, it has to be true if the Committee on Intelligence was dealing with it. And here we are in the very tail end of 2019, in which Adam Schiff is running that committee. And, you know, we've seen what's been coming out of that. So the State Department, it has to be true. It has to be. In February 1976, a photocopy of the bogus FM 3031B was left on the bulletin board of the Embassy of the Philippines in Bangkok, Thailand, with a cover note from an anonymous quote-unquote concerned citizen. This is a typical Soviet bloc practice. Surfacing attracted little attention. FM 3031B reappeared in 1978 when it was reprinted in two Spanish publications, El País of 18th of September and El Triunfo, 23rd of September. This was the work of a Spanish communist and a Cuban intelligence officer. Well, if you want to know about the background of Fidel Castro and other stuff, Tim Kelly's got a really good podcast on that deals with all of Castro's ties to America and certain influential persons there. So I'd say check that out, and we'll see about the Spanish communist and the Cuban intelligence stuff. Since September 1978, the manual and/or articles concerning it have appeared in the world press in more than 20 countries, including the United States. The hearings added that, quote, in summer 1979, the Soviets prepared Portuguese language copies of the forgery and covertly circulated them among military officers in Lisbon. We've got a whole nother page here. We're not going to read this. We'll go to the conclusion. And of course, let's do the second to last paragraph. Former CIA Director William Colby wrote about his role in setting up quote-unquote stay-behind networks in Scandinavia in his 1978 memoir, Honorable Men. One of the main fields of the Office of Policy Coordination, the unit in the CIA responsible for paramilitary activities, worked then, in 1951, was planning for the not unlikely possibility of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. And in the event the Russians succeeded in taking over any or all of the countries of the continent, the OPC wanted to be in a position to activate a well-armed and well-organized partisan uprising against the occupiers. But this time, unlike similar OSS paramilitary teams that went in to help the French Maquis and other resistance movements during World War II, and I would just like to point out that the French resistance and the Maquis executed plenty of civilians without trial, without any type of judicial regard. They would go into people's houses, and if they found any kind of fascist books in there or any type of authoritarian literature in your house, they would quite often drag people out and shoot them. And so this is who the American government was arming and working with. So they don't care. They don't care about killing civilians. They're perfectly fine with it. And part of this is why communism and the left was so dominant in France after the end of World War II, was because a lot of our guys were drug out and shot in the face or the back of the head with help from the American intelligence agencies, of course. So we have a lot to atone for. Let's see. The OPC didn't want to have to arm and organize those partisans after the occupation using such dangerous and fallible operations as night flights, supply drops, and parachute infiltrations behind enemy lines. No, this time we intended to have that resistance capability in place before the occupation, and indeed even before an invasion. We were determined to organize and supply it now, while we had the time in which to do it right and at the minimum of risk. Thus, the OPC had undertaken a major program of building throughout those Western European countries that seemed likely targets for Soviet attack what, in the parlance of the intelligence trade, were known as quote-unquote stay-behind nets, clandestine infrastructures of leaders and equipment trained and ready to be called into action as sabotage and espionage forces when the time came. Colby makes it clear that, so that's the end of the Colby quote. Colby makes it clear that the NATO allies with whom he worked in Scandinavia were full partners in such plans. Quote, the governments themselves would build their own stay-behind nets, counting on activating them from exile to carry on the struggle. These nets had to be coordinated with NATO's plans, their radios had to be hooked to a future exile location, and the specialized equipment had to be secured from CIA and secretly cached in snowy hideouts for later use, end quote. So what Colby's telling us and what they said at the beginning of this article are two completely different things. Colby's telling us that the CIA is setting everything up from top to bottom with the assent and the cooperation of these governments, whereas at the beginning of this article they're telling us that these governments set this stuff up on their own, and the CIA maybe helped them, but it was really at the initiative and the request, and that all the momentum was being provided by these countries. But that's not the case according to their own source that they're citing here. Conclusion: a 30-year-old Soviet forgery has been cited as one of the central pieces of quote-unquote evidence for the false notion that Western European stay-behind networks engaged in terrorism, allegedly at U.S. instigation. This is not true, and those researching the stay-behind networks need to be more discriminating in evaluating the trustworthiness of their source material. So what we've had in this article altogether is that the United States created terrorist organizations in all of these European countries. They operated for an indeterminate amount of time and did a bunch of activities that we really don't know exactly what they did. Some people accuse them of terrorism, and we had a writer from The Nation who said that claim was false. And, if you do things like get on Wikipedia and see how sources like Bellingcat and The Nation and CNN have the absolute top level of reliability in terms of sources and reporting about news, and about how anything that's critical of them is called the conspiracy theory source and basically prevented, entirely from being used on Wikipedia. And then you see how these articles on Wikipedia about like the Duma chemical attack in Syria, so-called chemical attack, completely follows the mainstream orthodox U.S. government-approved narrative. You can really see where they're coming from with all this. All the sources that they cite totally agree with them. Anything that's outside of it's conspiracy theory, but they don't really have any evidence for it. I really wanted to get into the discussion of pedophilia and the international child sex trade, which links up with Operation GLADIO, because the same people who are doing the legwork in Operation GLADIO in Belgium, for instance, are also involved in the Dutroux affair and all of that stuff with its links to people in Britain and, of course, the United States and everywhere else. Wanted to get into that, but really don't have time. So all of this stuff that I've been talking about is to say that this statement that the elites somehow want to intentionally cause this massive disruption, mass terrorist attacks in the imperial territory, since it disrupts commerce. Okay, they don't like us talking about this, guys. We're getting the flyby. So we'll just end there. How about that? Thank you, guys.